This is an update of an older video on this channel. Reaper software has been updated many times since that original one, so it's about time to show how to do this audio trick in the latest version. We'll talk about how to split one audio item into many smaller ones using a tool in Reaper called Auto Trim Split. Reaper has several tools that can save huge amounts of time and effort. The Auto Trim Split tool can automatically slice up a single audio file into multiple smaller files with a single click of a button. This is great for certain types of voiceover gigs and can also be really useful for music recording as well. Let's start by opening Reaper. If you do voiceover recording, you're going to eventually run into a job that requires you to save one long audio file into several smaller audio files, and then each one of those smaller files has to have its own name. This can be really tedious and take a long time. The kind of job that usually requires these are things that have dialogue between two or more people, text-to-speech jobs, and lots of e-learning jobs. A lot of e-learning programs require a separate audio file for each slide if it's going to be a slide presentation, such as a PowerPoint presentation or so on. So what we're going to do here is record a sample script, something similar to what I've done for a particular e-learning client. And we'll do it the hard way first, the way that most people would do this, and certainly the way I started out. Then I'll show you the automated way using the Auto Trim Split tool to make this job much, much easier. Okay, so let's open a track, come over to this space and double click. I'm just going to record 4 phrases that are similar to jobs that I've done. So I arm the track for recording. And when I'm ready, I hit the big red button. Here we go. To catch on means to understand. To float an idea means proposing an idea. To run the numbers means to evaluate something. To run amok means to proceed with no plan. All right, so we'll just go ahead and save that. Okay, let's disarm the track for recording. And as I zoom out, you can use your mouse scroll wheel or just drag this line down here. You can see it's all just one big audio item with 4 different phrases inside of it, so it's one audio file. I have a client who often needs exercises recorded for the students to listen to, where the narrator reads a list of sentences or phrases like this. The client asked that there be exactly 3 seconds between each phrase. Now this wouldn't be a big deal if it were only 3 or 4 phrases like this. I could just split the file and space them out manually, which I'm about to demonstrate. But usually there's more like 50 or 60 phrases or more, and the manual method then just becomes too tedious and too time-consuming. So I'm about to show you how to do it manually, but before we start that, I wanted to talk a bit about the snapping tool. This is turned on by default in new Reaper projects. And what it does is snap the edges of the audio item to the grid. See these grid lines right here? Look what happens when I drag this audio item in the track. It jumps from grid line to grid line. And we're going to need more control than that. So what we're going to want to do is turn off the snapping tool. Now you can see that I can drag it freely in between the grid lines, which is what we want. So I just mentioned the grid, but what do these grid lines here represent? We can tell that by right-clicking on the ruler up here above the first track where you see these numbers, and then go down to the bottom section of the drop-down menu, and you can see that measures and beats is what's selected. That's the default, and if you're recording music, that's great. But we don't want musical divisions, we need time divisions, specifically seconds, because the client wants 3 seconds in between each phrase. So now that I've done that, you can see that zoomed out, you can see 4 seconds, and that's 8 seconds, and that's 12. If I zoom in, more of those numbers become visible. So this is 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds, 4 seconds, etc. So make sure you change your ruler to seconds in order to do this manually. Anyway, let's get to that manual method of splitting and trimming these phrases. We talked about this in lesson 2, but as a reminder, let's start by trimming the start of the long audio file. Just put your cursor over the start of the file until you get this cursor shape. Then hold down the left mouse button and drag that to just before the start of the audio. Make sure you don't cut off the voice. Now put your cursor somewhere between these 2 phrases and hit the S key in order to split it. So I hit S and it creates a split there, creating 2 different audio items, the first one and then the other 3. But we need to trim the end of the first audio item. So again, Let's move this out of the way, make it easier. Hover your mouse over the right edge and drag it to the left. Again, make sure you don't cut off the voice. And now we have the first audio item trimmed and split out. Now we need to do the same for the rest. So just drag that. Let's put a split in there and a split in there and trim it up. You get the idea. Now you can start to see with 3 or 4, it's easy. But if you had to do this for 60 or 70 or whatever, it would be super tedious and take forever. All right, so now that we have 4 separate audio items created from one longer audio item, take a look at the space in between. We have a lot of variable space in between, and the first item doesn't start at 0, which we probably want it to. So we need to move them around until there's 3 seconds in between each one. So let's start by dragging the first item all the way to the left so it starts at 0. Then we're going to want this section in here to be 3 seconds, the space. So you can measure that by sort of eyeballing it here. This is a little after 3 seconds right there. So you're going to want the next one to start a little after 6 seconds. Trim that up a little more and drag it. So that's an approximation of 3 seconds. But let's go ahead and measure that by making a time selection in between. Then you can look down here and see that that's 2.826, which is not quite enough. So let's change that time selection and then look over here to the left and you can see the time changing as I drag the selection. So if we get that right up to 3, then we drag the item to correspond to that 3 seconds and then we repeat it with the next one. So this one ends a little after 10 seconds. The next one should start a little after 13 seconds in order to give us 3 seconds. So about right there. Now let's double check it by dragging, and that's 2.89. So that's not quite enough. Let's drag the selection to get it to 3 and then drag it back to match. Okay, and do the same thing with the last one. And there we have it. So even with only 4 items, see what a pain that was? Imagine having to do that for 60, 70, or 80. It would just be crazy. So that was the manual method. What I'm going to do now is undo all of that. So just click the undo button up here a bunch of times to get everything back to the way it was when we started. So now I've undone everything, and we have one file with the 4 blobs, the 4 phrases in it now. Okay, so what we're going to want to do is find the Auto Trim Split tool. This tool isn't very commonly used, so it doesn't have an icon on the toolbar or anything. So we go up to Actions on the menu up here and Show Action List. Then in this filter box, we type Auto Trim. Now you can see Item: Auto Trim Split Items. Remove silence. This is what we want. Okay, so let's click on that tool. And before we run it, we have to actually make sure that our audio item is selected. So click on Run, and you will be presented with this default set of options for Auto Trim Split. We're going to change these because look what happens if I push Process with the default settings. See, it made way too many slices there and created way too many items. So let's undo that. And here are the changes we're going to make. Click Run again. Let's change the threshold to -34. And in the Ignore Silence Shorter Than box, change 100 to 800. In the Make Non-Silent Clips No Shorter Than, change that to 200 milliseconds. And Trailing Pad, let's change that to 100 milliseconds. And these are the settings that I have found work the best. Let's go ahead and check it out. Hit Process, and there we have it. It trimmed and split our 4 phrases perfectly. Now let's create a shortcut on your keyboard for Auto Trim Split so you don't have to go through the process of going to Actions and then typing in Auto Trim every time you want to use it. So Reaper lets you assign it to a key on your keyboard. I usually use the Control tilde or Control accent key, which is in the top left of my keyboard. So I'm going to click in here and click Add, and then click Control tilde or Control accent there, and then click OK. Now you see that that appears here next to Auto Trim Split. So let's go ahead and try it with a keyboard shortcut. Let's undo what we did. Make sure your item is selected. Hit Control tilde on your keyboard. Brings up the same settings we put in last time. Hit Process, and we're done. Then if we wanted to drag everything to the left so that it starts at 0, hit the Ripple Edit button, and then drag this left item all the way to the left so it starts at 0, and everything else will come with it because you hit Ripple Edit. I always like to turn Ripple Edit off when I'm done with it. So that's a lot faster, isn't it, than having to manually go through and drag and then click the S key and then drag back and then click the S key again and then drag and do all that. So that is how you use the Auto Trim Split tool. You'll find a lot of uses for this, especially if you have another character in another track that you have to edit a conversation for. So if you have this person speaking and then that person has to speak, etc., etc., using Auto Trim Split will allow you to drag each person's part of the conversation around, and then you can edit it however you want, making things a lot faster and a lot more flexible.